is making a monster.
The film starts in a recording studio with Wallace hosting a podcast with his partner Teddy. They usually interview weird or interesting people, but today just watch a video of an internet star. He's gone viral for accidentally cutting his leg off, leaving the two friends to laugh hysterically at his misfortune. The next day Wally travels to Canada to interview the viral sensation, but first gets held up at the airport. It's going smoothly at first, with the border agent being friendly to the guest of his country, until hearing that Wallace doesn't like hockey and the mood shifts. The petty agent tells him to stop leaning on the counter and begins arguing over which country's the greater, claiming that the Canadian flag's only red and white because you never feel blue like in America. Wallace's podcast is called The Nazi Party, which confuses people throughout the film who think he's saying Nazi. He reaches the home of the Kill Bill kid but finds the family in mourning as he's taken his own life. That night he calls Teddy from a local bar to tell him the bad news, but selfishly cares more about the wasted money on the flight. He complains about how boring the Great White North is and how he wishes he never came, before going to the men's room to drain the lizard. A well-written note amongst the trashy adverts catches his eye, claiming to be from an old man looking to rent out a room. He says that he doesn't want to spend his final days alone and has a vast wealth of stories from his adventures at sea. Seeing this as an opportunity to salvage the trip, Wallace gets directions from two store clerks to the nearby town in hopes of getting an interview. When he gets there he finds that the man lives on a large estate called Pippy Hill, which Wallace walks straight inside unannounced and meets the wheelchair-bound homeowner Mr. Howe, who says that he prefers the intimacy of Howard. After going to the toilet for a second time already in this film, Wallace rejoins Howard in the sitting room where he expresses his intrigue over the letter. Explaining the raunchy things Wallace says on his podcast to keep his listeners interested, Howard remarks on how much freedom the current generation gets without any repercussions. While the guest enjoys his tea more than any he's ever tasted, Howard quotes Ernest Hemingway and says that he met him during World War II. The soft-spoken stranger was just a young man at the time and shared a bottle with the famous writer. He even kept it as a souvenir, saying that combined with the story it becomes a doorway into history. Catching the eye of Wallace is a bone on the mantle that Howard waits until he touches, before telling him it's a walrus penis.
Shut up.
He calls the walrus God's most noble creature and Wallace a rapscallion of the highest order. As his guest starts to become drowsy, Howard tells of the time his ship capsized and he was stranded on an island for 6 months. His only company was a walrus that he named Mr. Tusk, and says that it was the most blissful time of his life. Just then whatever the old man's put in the tea kicks in and Wallace drops to the floor unconscious. In a flashback, Wallace and his girlfriend Allie are discussing his upcoming trip to Canada and begin to argue. It turns out the Kill Bill kid's the one who invited Wallace to interview him, and he even felt bad about exploiting him, but justifies it by bragging that he made $100,000 on ad revenue alone last year. Allie says she prefers the old Wallace who wasn't making money but at least didn't exploit others for his own gain, but is talked back into bed by the silver-tongued mustache. As Wallace comes around he finds himself sitting in a wheelchair with Howard stroking his bone nearby. The old man claims that a spider's bite caused him to pass out, so he called a doctor to the house as he doesn't trust hospitals. Noticing that he can't move his left leg, the old man also tells Wallace that the doctor needed to take drastic measures and amputated it. He's also been strapped to the chair and has his cell phone taken, all of which Howard says was doctor prescribed. He knows it's ridiculous, but Howard leaves trying to hold himself back from laughing and saying sorry for your loss. At dinner Wallace calls him out on the lie, but Howard continues to plead spider and begins joking about how small it was. When Wallace calls him crazy, the fully able-bodied man hops up out of his seat, walks across the room and slaps him. He then comes clean and reveals his plan to put the podcaster in a walrus suit, where he'll only ever be able to make walrus sounds to communicate. Wally screams, which pleases the madman, who begins to simulate walrus sounds with him. Meanwhile, back in America, Allie's broken up over the news that her boyfriend's been cheating on her. In a flashback we see that Wallace admitted to Teddy before his trip that he cheated with one of his fangirls, so Ted's divulged this information to Allie to begin a relationship with her. After being missing for 3 days, Wallace finds his phone still intact and just misses a call from Allie. When he calls back he gets no answer and instead leaves a message about his horrific experience. Suddenly a lurking Howard strikes his experiment from behind and tells him that he's to be a walrus or nothing. He spends the night operating while monologuing about his traumatic upbringing that led him to hate all humans. His parents were murdered and he was put into an orphanage, but in a government money-saving scheme it was reclassified into a mental hospital, and he spent years enduring physical and mental abuse by the staff members. By now he's amputated Wallace's other leg, sewed his arms to his torso and removed copious amounts of flesh in his process of walrusification. When Allie hears the insane message from Wally, she has Teddy drive her to Canada in search of him. Once complete, Howard keeps his creation chained up in his new habitat, a full-blown Wallace walrus complete with tusks and flippers made from his feet. The extra flesh contains faces of other victims, and with his tongue removed all Wallace can do is scream and flail about. It occurs to Howard that to be a walrus he must learn how to swim, so with a winch he drags Wally into the water to force him to tread water. Unable to move his limbs he sinks to the bottom, where another failed walrus man lays decomposing, showing that the tusks are screwed into the skull. Once they cross the border, Allie tries to call the police, but the mention of the podcast title has them hang up. They ask around all of the places Wallace attended during his stay, but no one's heard of him or Howard Howe. When they finally speak to a detective, Frank tells them that there's no record of Howard living in the area. He does recall a French investigator in town hunting a serial killer and gives them his number to get in contact. The eccentric guy LaPointe meets them for lunch, where he squishes his burger and goes on a 2-minute straight monologue about his target. It's clear he's talking about Howard, as he explains the victims are always found with their legs missing and arms fused to their bodies. Their mouths had holes in the roof, which he believed to be the result of meat hooks, until finding part of the victim's leg inside. This means that these tusks are Wallace's own legs, which Howard was refining right in front of him. Guy's targets killed 23 victims so far, and he says that he met him a few years earlier. In another flashback, the investigator arrived on the porch of Howard searching for a missing hockey player. In a wonderful performance, the old man pretends to be mentally disabled and keeps talking nonsense until Guy politely leaves. A few days later, the hockey player's remains were found, but Howard disappeared without a trace. When he asked the victim's mother what she thinks happened to her son, she told him that the killer's creating a monster. By now, Howard and Wallace have made up and become best friends. Not really. Wally just can't move and is depressed listening to his master sing sea shanties. When he leaves, Howard gives Wallace a single mackerel and then watches him anxiously through a porthole as the walrus feeds. Meanwhile, Guy conducts his investigation, which has Wally's love for chug-a-lugs leading them to the two angsty teens, who recognize a picture of Wallace from his mustache and present a notepad that he used. Guy does a pencil rubbing over it to discover the address of Howard, who's currently swimming around naked with his pet walrus in the tank. He talks about how things will be different this time, as it's revealed he ate the original Mr. Tusk to survive. A boat arrived moments later to rescue him, and he's hated himself ever since for what he did to the noble creature. Because of this, Howard's decided to give Wallace what he never gave the original Mr. Tusk. With a fleshy walrus suit of his own, Howard demands Wallace fight him, giving him the chance to fight for his survival. They engage in an awkward flailing of body and tusks while a video plays in the background of the real thing. During the battle, Howard says that no matter how this ends, Wally will have to remain a walrus forever. Allie, Ted, and Guy come across Wallace's car in a pond and begin to converge on his location. Guy brings along his shotgun and passes the two friends pistols to make their way inside Poppy Hill. They hear Wallace scream and follow the sounds to the house, where the podcasting walrus's survival instincts have kicked in. Howard claims that so have his and stands up, shedding the suit to kill Wallace as a man. But when he goes to bludgeon him, the walrus takes over and Wallace drives a tusk into Howard's foot. He then runs the pair through the old man's chest repeatedly as Howard declares Wallace to be his true Mr. Tusk. After breaking through a few doors, Allie and Teddy enter and see what's become of their friend. The walrus has consumed him completely and he wails away covered in his captor's blood. Guy enters and aims his shotgun at the creature without much objection from anyone else as it fades to black. 1 year later, Allie and Teddy visit an animal sanctuary where Wallace is being cared for inside a tiny enclosure. He doesn't come out, so Allie uses a fish to attract him and it's devoured instantly. She calls out to Wallace, who finally looks up, and we have another flashback to their time spent dating. Allie mentions that Wallace never cries and that it's what separates us from the animals, with being the evidence that we have souls. Back in the present day, Allie begins crying and tells Wally that she loves him before leaving with Ted. Showing that he still has a soul, Mr. Tusk looks at the camera before shedding a tear and returning to his enclosure. He continues to scream even when no one's around to hear. And the movie ends.
The itty bitty spider crawled up the water spout. Now came the rain, and was the spider out